In this lesson, we're going to look at economic incentives and how we can use economic incentives to stimulate the transition from a linear to a circular economy. Now, this is part of the course that we're offering in circular economy from a regional perspective. And at regional level, it's not that easy to work with economic incentives because these are more questioned at national level. However, we hope that this module or this lesson will give you enough background to be able to give input to national dialogue about the need for economic incentives. There are two kinds of incentives. One is where you get the market to perform to requirements using instruments that affect signals in the market. The other alternative is to use rules and laws with a command and control approach. These break down, the market-based instruments break down into three kinds. There's a price-based, rights-based, and market friction. Now, price-based is about changing the relative price of something. The example of this might be smoking, and that if you in a country decide that you don't want people to smoke, you could always put a tax on the price of cigarettes or fat or sugar or whatever, and the idea would be that that would encourage citizens to buy less. Rights-based is where you give certain rights to certain market behaviors. An example here might be that you would offer parking only for electric vehicles in certain areas. And then the other one is market friction. Market friction, a good example of market friction is always like information and education. For example, labeling different kinds of household appliances, how good they are at saving energy, for example. And then we have the idea of nudge. That's where you might come with government information or some kind of stimulus which isn't really in proportion to the change in market behavior you want to see. Command and control. Now, this can include a voluntary control, it can include branch standards, but it can also include bans and government goals. So let's look at examples of these. In price-based, one is that you could put levies on packaging. This would increase the price of packaging, which would the price would go on to the end consumer. Swedish Jordbruksverket have suggested this in order to reduce the amount of packaging per product delivered. A rights-based example with waste might be to have waste picking as a recognised profession. This has been done in Brazil and I think also in India. So instead of people picking up waste who are maybe people who are challenged in the job market or with poverty in another way, that you recognise it as a profession. Market friction, a good example of a nudge, is to put a deposit on, for example, aluminium cans or glass bottles. It's enough to get people to change their packaging handling behavior. Command and control would include a ban on single-use plastic. Another example of price-based is that you could do something with repair costs. It makes sense that if it's cheaper to repair, then it might be more interesting for consumers to, or even companies, to repair what they have instead of buying new. And as we've seen earlier, buying new things creates a lot more pollution. And we hinted earlier that product marking requirements could also help in affecting customer decisions. In terms of command and control, there could be rules on end of waste. This is where the EU Eco-Design Directive is working in that direction. Price-based. In terms of waste, you could have a variable waste charging or a pay-as-you-throw. That's to say that if you have unsorted waste that's difficult to recycle, then it would have a higher charge. This, of course, would encourage people to change their sorting behaviour. And then pay as you throw. The more you throw, the more you pay. This would encourage people to throw less and repair more. One example of rights-based might be a green public procurement. It is where anyone in the public sector has to follow more extensive rules for public procurement. Let's just say they're more circular. Again, part of the Eco-Design Directive. Market friction is interesting. You could say if the state built circular infrastructure, let's just give an example. If the state built local transport, or even like they've done in Germany, to have very low price local transport, that would certainly affect buying behaviour. I mean, you're not forcing people, but it would make it more interesting for them to change their behaviour. In terms of waste, we have the idea of banning the incineration of recyclables. This would, instead of recycling something to heat, you would have to recycle it to something more useful. We've also seen this as a possible measure for the circular economy. Finally, in our package here, research could be seen as a market-based instrument, or as a market incentive. This is everything from basic research to development to demonstration, and even to technology and system evaluation. And let's not forget the definitions, including technical maturity levels and also best available technology. Research into best available technology could well influence not just companies buying, but also be part of green public procurement. So this was an overview of what's available in market-based instruments. Interestingly, there isn't a lot of research that really says that all of these work every time. And so what we'd like to do is to look a bit more about the way the economy works in order to understand that when you introduce a market-based instrument, that it might not always have the positive effects that you're expecting. We like to call this bathtub economics. And one way to understand economics, it doesn't explain everything, but it explains a large percentage of the way the economy works, is to think of all money, like that's to say people's money, which is probably most of it is in a bank account, is put together in one large bathtub. Think of that money as water. Now this water is going to flow down to enterprises and to government and to municipalities. So let's think of having taps on these bathtubs, taps and pipes and shower heads that connect all of them. Now, we're all familiar with this, that we have to pay our bills. So we could see the first move in this would be for citizens to pay their bills at the end of the month, and they'd be paying their taxes to government and maybe local municipal rates. This, of course, enterprises pay to government and municipalities pay. At the same time, there are transfers back from government to enterprises, and there are also transfers back to municipalities for services that enterprises do. And of course, all wages need to come back to citizens from all of these entities. And then it all starts again the next month, mostly. Now, there are some simple principles about bathtub economics. In a healthy national economy, money circulates, and it's important to keep the money circulating, and that it circulates to everyone. And this isn't about economic growth. The important thing is that every organisation and person has enough. That they have enough to avoid harming people, institutions and the environment. That's to say, they're not forced to, for example, steal and cut down forests that need to grow if they want to heat their houses. Citizens have enough to afford necessities, all citizens, basics of life. It's also important that enterprises have enough money that they can pay their bills so that they can deliver the necessities that they have in their mission statements. And it's also good and important that enterprises can have jobs, offer jobs available for everyone who can take them, and that there's enough money for governments and municipalities to afford to provide services. It's all pretty basic stuff, and that everyone can afford to do right by people and the environment. Now, this brings us to thinking about some of the myths that bathtub economics helps clarify. One of the myths here is that public spending depends on extracting money from people and the market. Now, that's not really necessarily true, because if there's enough money in the system, the public spending actually puts money into the system. It doesn't extract it. It's just important that it flows around. The other myth maybe is that austerity is the best way to reduce a government shortfall. We can remember here that the government can actually make this water from their accounts and put money, and as they do, and we've seen with quantitative easing, etc., they can put poor money into the market. Now, if you start to introduce austerity, what will happen is that people won't have any money or have enough money to buy things from companies. Companies will have to downsize. If they downsize, they can't offer work, and the whole thing goes into a negative recession spiral. So it's obvious that austerity is not a good way to reduce debt. Rather, it's about balancing the money in the system. One of the other myths is like money like gold is always in short supply. This is not true at all, that money is in short supply. It's the other way around. Because money is created digitally, there's enough money to be put in the system. It's where the money is in the system. It's not how much is in the system. That is the question. Another thing is that low wages are good for the market. It might be temporarily, but if everyone gets low wages, then they don't have enough money to spend, and especially they don't have so much taxes to spend. So you have a system imbalance there. We'd like to talk a bit about price signalling. because we want to think about influencing consumer behavior. Now, there are in place many mechanisms that change the price of something. We'll take for example here, there's a producer price and a consumer price. Now in the middle here is a mechanism you're familiar with, which is VAT. Now what VAT does is to add, in Swedish case, 25% onto the consumer price, and then that money is taken into government budgets. Now, in terms of understanding market-based instruments, one possibility to change the price the consumer pays is to think of adding an extra levy on top of VAT. Now, it could be selective. So that's to say that things that are really non-circular or counter-circular that you want to phase out of the market, then you could put an extra levy on it. This levy indeed could be flexible. However, we saw earlier that by raising prices, you actually take money, and especially in this case it's a levy, you will actually take money out of the system. You take money out where it could be doing more useful work. So when it comes to designing instruments, one thing you have to ensure is that this money goes back into the economy. Now, the absolutely simplest way to put money back in the economy is to pay a dividend back to all taxpayers. You could distribute this equally. Now, what would that mean in terms of incentives? Let's think about this in terms of this graph. We've got behavior over time, and then we've got the volume of entry into the economy. Let's say that you don't want something in the economy, something that is non-circular and dangerous. And for example, we could take fossil fuels. So the first thing you would think of doing is to have a phase-out rate that is sensible. That's to say, you keep the phase-out within planetary boundaries. At the same time, you keep it slow enough in order for the market system and industrial system to adapt. Now, we've talked about adding a levy on top of some kind of standard cost. We could say it might be VAT, but it could be something else. Now, if the phase-out rate doesn't happen as fast as the plan, what one could do is to increase the levy. Now, it's been suggested that you can increase a levy monthly. You can actually, a government can actually go out and say, we've decided to phase out X or Y, and that we're going to put a levy on one tax or whatever to change the price, make it more expensive. And we're going to increase the levy at regular intervals until the phase-out rate is achieved. Now, what makes this interesting, together with the idea of dividend, is that people who buy a lot of what we want phased out will be paying effectively more, and people who buy less will be paying effectively less because of the dividend back into their pocket. And this is really quite fair. It follows on the idea of the polluter pays. But just as interesting is the fact that people will have money in their pocket to buy circular alternatives. So that would say that there will be an increasing demand for polluting-free alternatives as this dividend starts to go into the economy. And what's interesting here is this will encourage the market to invest in more circular and environmental alternatives. Let's go back to our bathtub model, make it a little simpler. And then we can see that between the flows, you could have some kind of regulators. Now in engineering, they call these actuators. This is the levies and surcharges on the various charges that are in the system. Let's just go through some very simple examples of where you can add this levy and surcharge and where it could affect consumer purchasing behavior and in the long run the behavior or the economic behavior, industrial behavior of enterprises. First one would be VAT. That's at number 1 there. You could put a surcharge on an extra surcharge on VAT for things that are non-circular. You've got import fees. This is where we could stop the import of, for example, dangerous or environmentally dangerous materials. Number 3 here is between enterprises and government. That's risk substance surcharges for manufacturing and selling. Employers' taxes, we talked about repairs. It's possible to maybe have people who work with repairs pay less employers' tax on them. The property deed transfer fees, this is about how to change the market for real estate, things like that. And number 6 here is municipal fees. We said earlier that you could imagine having an extra fee on unsorted waste to encourage citizens to sort. And then of course personal taxes, people have talked about a personal carbon tax or things like that. So that gives you a rough idea about some of the intervention points. If we go back to our diagram of the simplified bathtub, there's something really interesting about the diagram, and that is that we haven't actually modeled in the environment. So how would we do this in a kind of a bathtub model? Money doesn't actually flow to nature or from it. However, resources do. And most resources are used by enterprises and even government-owned enterprises, municipal-owned enterprises. So let's simplify the model and say that it's enterprises that are using material. And it's also enterprises, one way or another, that are putting material back. Specifically dealing with waste, it might be a municipal. In many cases around the world, it might be a municipal responsibility and government responsibility, but at the same time, the actual handling is often done by firms, often corporations. So where would economic incentives fit into this picture? Well, you've got the first invoice. That's to say the enterprise that extracts from nature and then sells on. That's where the first invoice gets put. And of course here you could add all kinds of extra levies. Again, putting them back into the economy so that the economy will be able to afford alternatives. The same way with waste, you could put some kind of surcharge on waste handling to encourage there to be no waste and to work towards 100% circularity. Examples were import extraction surcharges, waste fee surcharges, and even repair deductions would affect the picture as a whole. So there's an example of this, a case we want to talk about. How to ensure carbon dioxide levies, I understand it's spelt wrongly, are effective and fair. The case we have is Canada, And what Canada did was to place a levy on fossil fuel, some kind of carbon tax, they called it. Now, the levy was collected and it distributed to individuals equally to every citizen. Now, those who purchase less fossil fuel end up being a little bit better off economically. Those who purchase more fossil fuel ended up paying more. This is probably the first case on a really large scale of trying to influence buying behaviour with a levy and dividend mechanism. So that's all we had to say about market-based instruments and how they might work, thinking about first invoices and last invoices. And there are some links in the references if you're interested in studying this area further.